morning, folks. We're finally here again today with Audrey and Pastor Jimmy, and we thought we'd say good morning and kind of continue our conversation about resources. Say hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, how's everybody today?
Got my coffee. I'm good. I just woke up.
Going down smooth.
Hey, that's good. I got my coffee too, so we're all in the same boat. It's been quite a while. It's kind of hard to remember where we left off at. But I think one of the things we were talking about is resources specifically. One of the things I've really been wanting to talk about is when we come out of like playing communities, we have like massive amounts of trauma. And for the typical average American who hasn't lived or even experienced that kind of life, they don't quite necessarily understand or grasp how severe the trauma can affect the brain. And so I was going to ask Audrey to talk a little bit about, like, what do you do when you feel like you're trying to educate people about the amount of trauma, but it's almost like they don't believe you, or they think you're making it up, or you're exaggerating it, or you're over-reporting it. Like, what do you do?
Well, that's a really good question. It's probably the reason I have 3 different therapists.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because it makes you feel like you're losing your mind, like, because you know what your truth is, and yet when you're not believed as a survivor, it invalidates you. And when you've got all this other trauma to process at the same time, so when you're advocating, you're processing trauma, and you're trying to educate people at the same time, it's emotionally very sticky.
Yeah.
But I know when I first went to find a therapist for myself, they shoved all these forms in front of me, especially for EMDR work and some of that stuff. They shoved all these forms, and they wanted me to check off boxes, and they basically wanted me to pigeonhole myself. I was supposed to fit into a category. And basically, are you crazy or aren't you crazy? And if you're not crazy, then what level is the trauma? Is it really bad enough for EMDR? It left me really frustrated because I felt pigeonholed, and you can't fit a square peg into a round hole. But I see that a lot, and it's not just in my story, but I see that a lot, like in a lot of different survivors that I work with, is trying to find someone who understands, because most of them do not understand the culture. And that's where I think the whole spiritual abuse piece plays into it pretty profoundly, because if you don't understand the culture and the damage that's done there, it's going to be really hard to understand the level of trauma that the survivor's enduring.
Okay.
But I went through 4 different therapists before I found somebody that, even though she didn't understand the culture, she was willing to learn.
Yeah. See, and that's one of the things that I talk about, is like finding somebody who's willing to learn. So like I kind of went through like a brief thing of like, there's like, I do an interview with my therapist before I ever like actually commit to working with that therapist. I do an interview, and then there's like 4 visits before I really decide that this is my therapist, because I moved a lot. So I've went through a lot of therapists, and some of them were like really, really awful. Like when you talk about that being spiritual abuse really plays a factor in there, is when you have somebody who has read these Amish romance novels, watched movies, TV, whatever it is, and they have these Amish neighbors, and my Amish neighbor's not like that. Your case is isolated, right? But the 10 other victims that I watched as children being sexually assaulted, my case is isolated. I'm supposed to believe that. So it makes you feel like you're being like, not only the fact that your culture is misunderstood, I felt like it made me feel like I was being called crazy, because I was talking about things, and the very person I went to for help wasn't helping me.
And they're supposed to be the ones that are educated. They're supposed to be the ones that you can go to for help. And so that messes with you in a whole different way.
Right. And so I'm going
Mhm.
to tell you something that my therapist always says, and it's true. You are the expert on your own trauma. You're the expert on your own life.
Mhm.
And don't ever let anybody else tell you different.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes.
But so how did you navigate that? Like, how did you get out of that from like to find somebody that you can actually work with? Like, can you walk
Well,
us through that process?
for me, it's still an evolving process because there's just not many people that understand the culture. There are more and more therapists who have, like, I'll be honest, the advocate from Rape Crisis, who is trauma informed, she doesn't have a trauma degree, but she's trauma informed. She has done more for me than most of my therapists have. Um, just because she understands, and she understands the culture, and she's been willing to learn to understand the pieces that she doesn't know. The first therapist that I had, um, after after I left my husband the second time, I went to a completely new therapist, just started fresh, and she had no idea what the culture was like other than TV shows, right? But she was willing to learn, and I still see her to this day because she understands my background and she understands where I've been and how far I've come. If I want to go for special therapies, I obviously have to go elsewhere. And I'm looking for some new avenues, like we need to change it up. But what I find is because I've done so much self help work and self growth, and because I'm an expert on my culture and my own trauma, I often know as much or more than the therapist. So it's really hard to find a therapist that gets it and that can actually help me. And so I work with somebody for a little while, and then we kind of hit walls because, well, I've outgrown that. So for me, it's just a continual, like, okay, so this doesn't fit anymore. So what's my next option? And
Yeah.
I've learned I just have to be, you can't, I started therapy thinking, okay, I'll just find a therapist and I'll just stick with this person and this is just going to fix it all. And it doesn't work that way. Like I found it's an evolving process. And it's been the same way with my kids. Like we started with several different therapists. It seemed like a good fit. And then some therapists were like, okay, wait, their trauma is way above my head. You need to go elsewhere. And then, well, that therapist didn't really fit, so we bopping around. They have all got stable therapists now, but there's still some tweaking that has to be done. It's a lot of it's just the nature of the culture.
And that's part of, I feel like, one of the biggest things that I've found so horrific is like, not only do we have this culture, but this culture that, and this is why I always say the Amish are not just a religion, they're a business, and their branding is damn good.
Mm.
Because you think about this, somebody who survives like extreme abuse inside of that culture comes out of there, goes to somebody completely unrelated, like over there, like somebody not even anything to do with the culture. And what is their first instinct? Defend the culture
Mhm.
and
Yep.
validate the person sitting in your office that lived in the community, that lived through all of these things, and defend the culture. That is some damn good branding.
Yep.
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that because I think we're not the only people that go through this, and other people can benefit from hearing that this is something that happens sometimes. And I think you talked a little bit about like somebody that's willing to learn. Like, for me, I learned for me, it's okay for somebody to be willing to learn. I'm okay with that. As
Mhm.
long as they're open and they're willing to learn and they're willing to kind of like have a basic knowledge, like at a minimum, go Google my culture. At a minimum, that's minimum. But also, when I start talking about some of the culture, you don't get to sit there and tell me that this doesn't exist
Mhm.
because that's not helpful. And I'm not going to educate you on the entirety of my culture. That's not my job. I came to you for help, and I'm paying you to give me help. So I
But
deserve to have some help.
do you know how hard it is to find a therapist like that, though? Like, seriously, I mean, let's be real.
Yeah. Sometimes it makes me wonder why, truthfully, like the therapist that I have now, really truthfully, the thing is I started interviewing my therapist way before this one. But I had went to see like a few different therapists. One of the therapists told me that I was only attracted to women because I have, quote, mother issues. One, you don't do that to me. Never going to talk to her again. I'm cool. Bye. Another one was very much like trying to talk to me about like you have to forgive, da 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 da, and I was just like, nope, you don't get to say that. You're supposed to be a trauma therapist, and you're telling your clients you have to forgive. Nope.
Well, I had one literally look at me and say, "Well, I really don't know how we can go further. You have so much trauma. I don't even know where to start." I was like, "Then why are you in that chair?" That's why
Thank
I'm
you.
here. I mean, no shit. I already knew that. That's why I'm here.
Wow.
Then I had another one. She was a little bit different, but I always pack heat everywhere I go. Like, I have to, right? And she found out that I do, and she was like, "Oh, well, you can't have this in here." I was like, "Okay, well, it's the last day I come to your office then, because I know what I need to keep me safe. And if you're not comfortable with that, then that's fine. Bye."
Well, good for you for understanding that that wasn't on you.
Yeah,
Because here's
I know
another
that my
thing.
safety is up to me now.
Here's another thing is like it's sometimes like we get looked at like we're animals in a zoo almost,
Hmm.
and we're not animals in a zoo. We're human
It's like
beings,
we're
and
an exotic species or something.
yes, exactly.
But doesn't society as a whole just like to pigeonhole people, though? I mean, is
Hmm.
it limited? I'm not sure that it's necessarily limited to us, but I definitely feel it.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's limited to us, but definitely I think it's absolutely like there's a lot of pigeonholing that happens. But here's another one is like people have often tried to tell me that I am paranoid because when you start talking about like some of the symptoms of the trauma that we live through, and then also the fact of like for us, like we know that our safety is up to us.
Hmm.
Nobody else is going to keep us safe except us. And
Hmm.
we learned that lesson, and we learned that lesson well because nobody knows all of the events that transpired in created all of this massive trauma or how much they harass, threaten, and stalk us.
Hmm.
But when you start talking about that to a therapist and your therapist kind of calls you a little paranoid, like,
Yeah.
yeah. But anyways,
If the therapist doesn't understand it, the least they can do is just be validating. Like, but don't sit there and invalidate me. Don't sit there and ask me what I need and then tell me, "Oh, that's a ridiculous expectation." I literally had that happen to me last week. And I'm just like, "Well, then why did you even ask me what I need?" I mean, like, so yesterday I went to look at a motorcycle and I went with an acquaintance, someone I don't know well, a male friend. And we went to look at this bike together because I wanted advice and grabbed supper afterwards. It was perfectly fine. There was, like, I was safe, so to speak. I came home, went to bed, woke up in the middle of the night, 1 a.m., completely PTSDing, like almost out of my mind PTSDing. Had nothing to do with what happened. That just triggered it. And I literally, those type of episodes, I've had therapists sit there and look at me and say, "Well, I really don't know how to help you with that.
are
Why are
you
you in your
serious?
chair?" Hmm. So I've learned to self-educate and figure out how to handle it myself. And that's what I hear from so many survivors. They don't know what to do with my trauma. So many of them are just, they're trained in talk therapy, they're trained in formulas, but they don't understand how to walk people through that level of trauma.
Our mental health system is broke.
It's very
It really
broken.
is.
I just can't even. But yeah, no. So anyways, I would encourage people to really like find a therapist that they're comfortable with, and that can look different for you in different parts or of time in your journey as you walk with your trauma.
And don't be afraid to say this one isn't working and walk away. Because in the
Yep.
beginning, I felt so bad to just walk away and say, this just isn't working for me. I had to learn how to do that. And now, if it doesn't work, I just walk away from it.
Yeah, I'm just like, nope. I had another one in the beginning. Sorry. I'm going back to the therapist. We have to move on to the next topic. But I have all these scars on my arms. And I had a therapist in the very beginning, probably like within the first 2 years actually, that I left the community and I went to see her. And she said, I can't work with you unless you admit that you're self harming. Okay, first off, all of those scars she was talking about, I give y'all two guesses where they come from.
Hmm.
Your abuser and your abusers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Wow. I am sorry.
I
That's
think
unreal.
that was one of the most devastating things that I've ever heard of. And I walked out of her office and I called my friend who was Mennonite at one point in time. And I said to her, I said, this is what she said. And I don't even know, like, and she was like, don't you dare go back to her.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
and
didn't.
even with like with my children, I mean, I had a couple children through a couple periods of time, that were very unstable. And, therapists would start working with them and they'd be like, this is way over my head. I do not have the skill set for what your child needs. You need to look at other options. Well,
What
I
other?
respected those therapists for being honest and upfront and not pretending, not winging it when they weren't equipped. But do you know what that does to a survivor? Do you know what that did to my child?
Hmm.
I'm too much. My trauma's too much. I can't be helped.
Yep.
And they're already self-harming and suicidal. So stop and think a minute what that does. I'm not now there again. I'm not blaming the therapist. I'm glad they were upfront with me. They didn't have the tools, and that's fine. But admit you don't have the tools and give somebody resources. Don't just
Yep.
sit there and tell, and like in your situation, invalidate them.
Yep. Yep.
The secondary trauma then almost becomes worse than the original trauma.
Exactly. Because the secondary trauma is exacerbating and adding an additional layer of trauma to the original trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But, anyways, Jimmy, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting back and listening, and I know like this has been the experience for so many survivors. Like in advocacy and ministry, I've heard so many people come and share these stories, and I'm like, our system is really broken. And I've known therapists, not personally. I don't, they're not friends of mine, but I've known multiple therapists who are not well. Um, they don't know how to process their own stuff, and they have practices where they're trying to help other people work through their trauma when they're, I mean, wildly addicted to alcohol, to pills, to having their own PTSD episodes and publicly talking about, and they're just angry, and they're the ones who are helping people who are desperate for help.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about this like with our medical system, because we have the same problem or a similar problem with our medical system, where people go from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor. And I remember a time, not in my lifetime, but a generation before, where you had doctors who were so stinking knowledgeable. They don't know everything, but you had doctors who would show up at a house, and if somebody had a broken arm, they would put a splint on in the home.
Mhm.
Like if somebody needed stitched, they would stitch them. They carried their bag. They had this big honking manual where they would be able to diagnose, and they were really accurate most of the time. They weren't perfect, but they were really accurate. Now we have such specialized doctors that you go to a doctor for a general problem and the doctors almost don't have a clue what to do. And we have this bleeding over into the mental health. And
Can
I
I
heard oh, go ahead.
can I add to that?
Yeah.
It's it's not even just a problem of that, it's also the problem of, like, increasingly, let's come from the administrative side of medical care, where medical care is absolutely providers are being told they have to meet this amount of productivity, it's based on
Yeah.
money,
So the
it's
medical
all
care is
about the medical
secondary.
field,
Yeah.
like, the medical care is secondary to, like, earning the appropriate amount of money for the
Yes.
facility that they're working for, and so they're like, you have 15 minutes to see this patient. And so in that 15 minutes, they're expected to do everything, including their documentation.
Yeah, and the other
And it's
part
a
of that, Mary,
little
I mean, the other part
unrealistic.
that you're exactly right. And the other part of that that's incredibly frustrating is at the same time you're having the general population being shouted down for not following science. We saw this with the coronavirus, that people are not willing to uh, to think and search on their own. And even my brother, who's a medical doctor, he's a very good medical doctor. He was so frustrated, and he was like, "There is so much misinformation going out there." And he said, from the CDC, he was like, "The CDC." He's like, "They are creating such problems for the general public, for all of us doctors in the entire United States of America." He's like, "They've made our jobs 10 times harder because they look like a bunch of bumbling idiots." And he's like,
You can't do that.
it's this frustrating system, and there's no um, there's no sense anymore. There's no common sense anymore. Um, and I remember, like, as a kid, we would get sick or we would get hurt, and my mom she would say, "Well, I think it's this," and it'd be like this really bizarre, like off the wall. I don't want to say diagnosis because she never said she was diagnosing us, but she would take us to a doctor. She wasn't one who would like self-medicate her own kids. She would take us to a doctor, and sure enough, the doctor would give a medical diagnosis and say, "Yep, this is what it is." It's just that we've lost that ability. Like, therapists are losing this ability to be able to work with people with what my good friend Christine Parker, who was a therapist for years, very good one. She did a podcast with us and with my mom and I, and she said, it's interesting. Like, the brain is the most important organ inside of your body, period. And that's the one organ. Take any other organ. Take the heart. Somebody goes into a hospital, they have chest pains or they have a tingling sensation going down their arm, you are rushed to the back immediately. They do all kinds of EKGs, they do scans, they do, on and on and on and on and on. They will get to the bottom of that pain. They'll figure it out. Period.
Check your Tronopin, all your stuff. Yeah.
They don't just start giving you different medications and like without looking at your heart, and they're like, well, one of these will eventually work. But when it comes to the brain, she said, like, they just start pumping you full of all these meds. And even in talk therapy, it's like, well, let's try this, let's go down this route and see if this works. And it's like they're working blind with the most important organ in your entire body. It controls everything. And it's frightening. So I don't know what the solution is, but it creates such compound trauma for people who already experience compound trauma, and it needs to change. We've got to get a better mental health system.
Well, see,
It's
and like
got to change.
it has to change. It also, I think, part of like starting change is by starting a conversation about it in a public way. And when you start conversations about things in public ways, like often it can start change.
Yeah.
I just really think that people in general, they don't realize or understand. Like, I also know that, somebody close to me like says that you can't have PTSD unless you were in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, not
It
even
doesn't
gonna
work that way.
argue with you and your misinformation here. I don't have the energy, the spoons, I don't have that kind of time. And it's not my job to like educate everybody around me. That's not my job.
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't have to
even
do that.
just take CPTSD and PTSD and all the misconceptions between both of those two. I mean, they don't. I mean, it's ridiculous. But like Jimmy was saying, like we're talking about the brain here. Like
Mhm.
my daughter's in psychiatric care and they're pumping her full of meds. Nobody's bothered to try to figure out what the root issue is.
Yeah.
So I find out what the root issue is,
Well, let
and
me
then
ask
I
you this,
have to.
Audrey. Has she ever had a brain scan? Have they ever done blood work to see what's going on with her blood? Like just basic
Mhm,
information. Have they done any
exactly.
of that?
They didn't do that until she started having seizures. And we went through this whole big long, well, all of a sudden, when she finally falls down at school in band camp with this full blown seizure, oh, we better figure this out. And I've been like, it's just been 2 years that I've been begging people to like stop and quit, just quit the med talk. We've got other issues here.
Yeah.
And so finally, and you know what, at the end it was? Seizures caused by post traumatic stress disorder,
Hmm.
trauma to the brain.
Yep.
And the doctor finally looked at me and he said, once she processes her trauma enough, the seizures will stop. And that's what they did. She's been seizure free for a year and a half.
Wow.
But
Huh.
I had to figure all that out. Like there was nobody to step up to the plate. We had to advocate for ourselves. I had to push the doctors and push the doctors. And I had to say, no, you're not giving her this med. I had to wean her off of this and wean her off of that because they were clueless. And I
Hmm.
got so frustrated because they had all these titles. Well, you go to this specialist and you go to this specialist and you go to this specialist. And I knew it was trauma. I knew that's what it was, but no
Yeah.
one had a broad enough education to be able to help. They just sent us somewhere else.
Do you
Yeah.
think that in general, medical doctors aren't necessarily well educated enough on trauma to really understand how trauma affects your body?
No, I don't think they are.
I
Depending
doubt
on
it.
your field, especially not. Like I haven't
Like
found it that
general
way.
practice, like, because I mean, like I've had a few different GP doctors, and so one of um, one of my last conversations with my doctor, because my old doctor retired. My old doctor was amazing, just amazing. Like she totally got like the genetics, all of those things. Like she got all of that. But like this one, so I go see this new one, and he says to me, he says, "Well, you were diagnosed with like this and this like really young." And I was like, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Do you think that's like family history, or is that like your trauma, or actually is it a combination of both?" Like he's actually having a conversation about this of like, okay, the trauma also plays a role in this, which is true, it does.
Mm-hmm.
But it was shocking to me because that wasn't necessarily the case in some of the doctors I've had before. Like it was like they didn't understand or grasp that like trauma can really affect your body.
Well, I mean, okay, so let's take just this example. Like I go into the OB and she traumatized me so bad. I had a panic attack in her office. And she knew I was a rape survivor and all of this. She didn't give two flips. How do you work in women's health? How do you
Oh,
work in women's health and not understand rape trauma, domestic violence? I don't even understand that. Like, how do you not even, how are you? She was so cold and so clinical and so hard. There was no compassion whatsoever. I walked out there and I never went back. It was the most awful experience I'd ever been through. And I'm sitting there trying to figure out what my ex gave me. And I'm just like,
and
How
then
are you in the medical
Yeah.
profession?
Wow.
like what they should be doing, Audrey, in that case is number one, like they're supposed to have somebody that specifically comes and sits with you if you are a survivor of rape or trauma like that, when you go to OB, because they know. And like one of the things that my doctor that I really respect does is like she actually talks me through like everything that's going to happen.
Mhm.
and then asks if I'm ready for this part of the exam.
Mhm.
She's very respectful, and that
Mhm.
I will always respect her for.
Absolutely. That's how it
Mhm.
should be. When my kids went in for their forensics, that was the first time I was with a medical team that was trauma informed, that was respectful, and that was compassionate. And they didn't do anything with me or the children until we were ready for it. And they walked us through it very gently, very compassionately. They had a minimum of 2 to 3 people there the whole time. And they knew, they you could tell the environment was completely different than your general doctor's office. But
Mhm.
that should be the norm.
That
Mhm.
should be the
Yeah.
norm. They should have that, like, compassion, they should show that, but when you make healthcare a business, this is what you get.
Mm.
You get people only doing it for the wrong reasons because they want money or they this or they that, and then it becomes this other experience for the patients, and you know who gets lost the most? By the way, we have a comment about this. Significant other is seeing 6 different doctors and nothing is integrated. I am a healthcare provider, and he's probably, "Oh my gosh."
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yep,
the
that's
insanity of the healthcare system.
it
Hmm,
is.
that's crazy. So, maybe we need better trauma education for, in general, medical providers. That's my thought process. That's where I end up at.
Well, I
Yeah, I
think
think
it goes back to our conversation we had last time. I mean, about midwives and taxi drivers and everything. I mean, as a whole, we need better trauma information. People need to be educated.
Yep.
yeah. Yeah, and I think just generally, even if there was a general knowledge of what trauma looks like, I mean, if you ask the average person, or above average person for that matter, what does trauma really look like? How does it manifest itself? Um, my guess is that people are not going to have a clue. You're going to get some wildly different answers. It's not even close to what it actually looks like. So, even if there's just a general education from, beginning in the school system, like to talk to
Hmm.
kids.
Hmm.
Um, if you are experiencing trauma, this is what it looks like, and no, you're not broken,
Hmm.
right? Because so many kids, how many kids are walking around right now in school feeling like they can't talk to anybody, including their very best friends, because they feel like
Hmm.
something's wrong with them.
Yep.
They don't know what trauma looks like. Begin in the school systems, um, teach it at college. Just have a gen ed course at college that says this is what trauma looks like. Um, have a course at medical school, at nursing school, just one course. And I think that would revolutionize, right?
Hmm.
Therapist. How many therapists are like, oh, I don't know anything about trauma?
But you're a therapist.
I know,
What do you think you're gonna get? Everybody you get is gonna come to you with trauma.
right? Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, because that's life,
Yep.
right?
I
Yeah.
Yeah.
don't care who you are, you
So,
have some level of trauma.
yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
Yep.
Well, I mean,
Yep.
like you were talking about the school system, and I think that's a really good point to bring out. So, like, take my one daughter, for example, she went through all sorts of stuff at school. And on top of her other trauma, but the nurse, the school nurse, she is amazing. And I'll tell you what, that woman played such a huge role in my daughter's life and in her healing. And if all the administration had had the knowledge and the
Yes.
compassion that that woman had, my daughter's school experience would have been completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different.
Yep.
Yep.
Ooh.
Well, and I think too, as a pastor, this needs to be taught in our seminaries too, because we have in so many churches, we have people who create trauma um, on top of people's already compound trauma. because they're absolutely clueless, and they're cold and callous like your OB was, just in different ways.
Yeah.
Their cold and callousness, and I'm talking people who are not themselves abusers. They're just clueless. And so they're like, well, you just need to go to your prayer closet and pray more. Well, guess
Well,
what? That doesn't work.
It doesn't.
You just, and it's, first of all, you don't tell people what they need to do. When people have trauma, you don't tell them what they need to be doing.
Nope.
Then they tell them things, like the whole, we've talked about this before, but the whole, you need to forgive your abuser and then you'll find healing. Guess what?
that doesn't
You
work.
just took any chance of me healing, and you exasperated that by placing this burden on my shoulders, because you're not asking anything of my abuser. Again, it comes back to me. What do you need to do as the victim? How
Puts all
about
the responsibility back on the victim.
right?
Well, and there's
You
no
know?
accountability for the perpetrator. And these are the people who I always say are complicit, Jimmy. They're complicit.
Mhm.
They're literally
Yes.
complicit. And there's a form of psychological abuse that comes with that.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
can't tell you for how many years I had nightmares about being told I have to forgive.
Yeah. You know what would be more healing? I think, I think about this a lot.
Yeah.
If I were abused, and I wasn't, so it's hard. I empathize with people who are abused, but in the end, I was not.
I'm curious.
But what would help me is if somebody would have said what my detective friend said about my dad. She looked at us when we were in the police station, and in half jest, I said, "What do we do as a family? How do we heal?" And she said, "You want to know what you do?" She said, in her words, she said, "You hog tie that son of a bitch, and you each take turns beating the crap out of him." She's like, not to hurt him, just to make yourself feel a little bit better. She's like, "Just hog tie him and humiliate him." She's like, "That would begin the process of healing for you guys." And I was like, for the
I
first
know.
time, yeah, right? Like, for the first time, it was this. She wasn't telling us what we had to do. It was, you want to start to bring healing, humiliate the person who needs to be humiliated for the things that he's intentionally done to cause all of this carnage.
Do you know how healing it is for me personally? This is just on a personal level. Do you know how healing it is for me when people get angry for me? When people get angry at him, at the people who have abused us, when they actually put the responsibility where it belongs and express anger and talk about what they deserve. Do you know how healing that is for a victim?
Yeah.
But we're told that that's
Right.
revenge and that belongs to God and blah, blah,
Bitterness.
blah. All
Yeah.
that bullshit.
No.
Yeah.
No. You know what the Bible says about rapists? We should stone them to death. I thought about that greatly after I went to one of your hearings.
Yeah.
We should stone him.
But it's validating just to hear that. Like, even if it's hyperbole, right? Even if it's, like, we're obviously we can't legally or ethically
do any of those
we can't
things.
hog tie people and beat them up. We can't stone we can't do that. I mean,
no.
And we knew that. She wasn't telling us. It wasn't a detective telling us,
Right.
like, I think you ought to tie him up and beat him. She was just saying, she was doing what you said, Audrey. Like, she was sharing in our anger and saying, like, what he did is inexcusable, period. And this all belongs on him. This is all on him. That's all she was saying to us. And I was like, it lifted this burden where we had to quit. She was trying to make us quit feeling guilty for the things he did. Where in churches and in therapy, often they do the exact opposite. And they're like, well, unless you forgive this person and release them of that, you're never going to heal. Well, that's not fair.
No.
That's not true. And that's not right. A better response is, you know what? Like, as a therapist, if I could legally, I would call him up and I'd ream them out, and I'd tell them, like, you go live in a cave somewhere and you're never allowed to come out, you know? Like, we're going to seal you in there. That would be more validating than, Audrey, you need to, the reason you have trauma is because you have bitterness in your heart and you just haven't forgiven. It's just so backwards, like we
It
really,
is so
really, really,
backwards.
yeah.
It's so backwards that I've been out of it long enough. So, like, when we were filming for the documentary, part of it was reading the letters that I received from the church and the father-in-law, the ex-father-in-law, and years of them. And I'm going back through these letters and I'm going, wow. Like, it
Yeah.
just was like, I don't believe that crap anymore. I'm so far removed from it, but it's like it is so ingrained into the religious culture, period, but especially the plain culture, that if you don't forgive and reestablish relationship, that you're somehow bitter and
Yeah.
you're revengeful. And like the gaslighting and the manipulation around it, I was just like speechless. I couldn't even read the letters without laughing. I had to do it so many times over for the camera because I was just like, this stuff is psycho.
Yeah.
So it's kind of almost like, well, since the last time we talked, I think I went to the Amish Abuse Awareness Conference. That place, I'm sure you've seen a few things I've wrote about it.
Yeah.
Audrey, that place, it was literally like unbelievable how they just, oh my God. And now I'm just like sitting here and I'm like, I don't surround myself with people that believe it's okay to treat children this way. It's okay to treat people that way. Like, I literally looked around myself in this place and was like, what am I doing here? And then I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. But at the end of the day, it really also was validating because it's like, not only is the trauma just as bad as I remembered it, it's worse.
Yeah.
It's worse.
It's worse. Just like that. Like
And I think it's so important to not just believe a victim. And maybe you can speak to this a little bit, Jimmy, but everyone says, believe, there's a point for believing, but there's also a point where a victim needs to be validated and you need to get angry for them.
Yes. Yes.
There is a difference. You can believe someone and still not take action.
Yeah.
Well, see, like even this is what happens to victims too. It says my doctor lied in my records and said I was self-harming and suicidal. Again, like believe and get angry for them.
Yeah.
Treat them, stop, another thing is don't look at victims as if like they're broken or like even talk about like them being broken. It's not, you're not broken. You're whole.
Right.
And I don't even know what country this is, but there's a country where like if they break a piece of china, what they do is they take gold and they put it back together and it adds to the beauty of the piece of china. And that's kind of how I feel about the complex trauma. It's like you break apart, but when you start working through and processing all of that complex trauma, it mends itself back together, but it's different. It's never going to be the same as you're never going to be the same as you were before the trauma.
Yeah.
But you can still be whole. You can still be
uniquely
beautiful.
You're right. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. 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 I think
there's a difference between looking at someone. Go ahead.
No. Go.
No, I was just going to say there's a difference between looking at someone as broken and saying that they just need to heal so they can be normal. There never will be normal. And besides, who defines normal anyway?
Right.
But I think one of the most painful things as a survivor is when you're looked at as different, as abnormal, as broken, because then you never feel like you'll ever be able to reassimilate into whatever people think is normal, because you never will. You're different. Like Mary said, you're put back together differently, but there's nothing bad about that. It's actually really beautiful.
Yeah.
We need to remove that stigma from it, because we're hindering not just the healing of survivors, but we're also here hindering society as a whole because they can't how to put the word to this.
So,
Go ahead. Maybe you can say it.
are you trying to say something about like so society progresses very slowly as a whole anyways, but there's a natural evolution that happens when we're open with things, and so by not having these conversations, it's hindering the actual societal collective growth of our country, of our nation, of our world, because there's no conversation around it, or there's no appropriate conversation around it. So we're not um, collectively understanding these things about trauma.
Yeah, that's a fancy way of saying it. But that was kind of where I was going with it.
Well, why don't you say it not fancy?
Well, I think we hurt ourselves as society when we look at survivors as broken, because we have so much we can learn from survivors. So much. They're not abnormal. They're not broken.
Different
They've
is
been
not less
damaged. They've
than.
been wounded. Exactly. Exactly. So it does more than just damage the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, go ahead with what you were saying,
Yeah.
Jimmy. That was my rapid
Yeah,
trail.
no, so many thoughts going through my mind. I mean, the first thought, what if therapy was conducted that way, where instead of diagnosing and um, and bringing back to normal or healing somebody, you just said, therapist said, like you said, I mean, you said it earlier, the best therapists are the ones that say, I want to learn from you. What if therapy was conducted that way? What if that was routine? What if that was normal? Where sure, they're still there to guide you, but they're also there to learn. And and then I look at the church culture, and I think what Mary was describing with the broken china and putting the pieces back together, which by the way is a tedious process.
Well, nobody said it wasn't tedious.
Right.
It's very tedious to heal from complex PTSD.
That's right. So that doesn't work in the church. Because I always say, like, this is my thing. We're so addicted in Western culture. We're so addicted to these instant transformations, and I talk a lot about the testimony boards that where you put on the one side, I was addicted, and then you spin it around. Now I'm free, free from addiction, and they parade these people across the stage, and in the mind, what that does is it creates,
I'm
right?
sorry.
I
can't.
I know.
Hold
right?
up.
It's
No.
This must have happened to somebody somewhere. I'm sensing that this happened to one of you.
Oh gosh, let's not start with the stories. Go ahead, Jimmy.
All right.
We'll
So
stop
go
laughing.
on. See what I mean? Like, look what this brings up, right? It's so nonsensical. But man, does it give this powerful story, like to parade these people across the stage and to say, this is what I was, this is now who I am in Jesus. It's like this magic wand instant transformation, and trauma never works like that ever.
It makes Christianity a business.
Right. So, what happens is theologically, these pastors are always on the gas pedal, hurrying people up, like, hurry up, you gotta change, right? Jesus, if you really believe in Jesus, he's going to transform your life. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's going to be this instant transformation. He's so powerful, he can do it. And all you have to do is just believe. And that is extremely false, fake, untrue, unbiblical, hurtful to survivors. Self-validating, selfish on the part of pastors and church leaders. And it's just, it's insanity. What I think is a more biblical model, right? What Mary talked about is sitting with people among these shattered pieces and saying to the person who broke the china, which one of these pieces is most important to you? I'm going to help you find that piece. I'm going to dig through all of these shattered pieces. And if there's one of these pieces that means the most to you, if that was the part of the plate that grandma always picked up first when she pulled it out of the cabinet, I'm going to help you find that piece. And I will dig and dig and dig for weeks if that's what it takes until we find that piece. And we're going to start with that one. Like, that would be a more appropriate response.
But then you're not giving them the instant gratification that they crave.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, if you're not instantly healed, then you lack faith. Like our viewers said, like you said, like we all know that that's a thing that often happens. But if we here's another thing is like in one of the books that I read, Lost Connections by Johann Hari. I don't know if either of you have ever read it, but it like talks about like in depth like about some of these Western society issues and the instant gratification, but also the loss of connection, which leads to like depression, anxiety. I think sometimes people don't realize like how much you have to actively work at being connected to people. And when you listen to people, like really try to listen to hear them rather than listening to respond. Listening to respond is very self-serving. It is very, which is kind of what I feel like the pastors are doing in your scenario is they're listening to respond. Like, oh, you have an addiction to alcohol.
And not just that, Mary. I mean, worse, they're taking people's real, genuine pain and that whole process of getting sober, and I mean, which sucks, right? Like that is brutal. They're taking that and they're showcasing that for their own gain. They're using somebody's real pain, and they're exploiting them to say, like, hey, look, this is who Jesus is. He's this instant healer. No, he's not. Right? Like, I mean, certainly there are circumstances where he does instantly heal people, but you know, those are people he personally touched and he chose to heal them. But I mean, even in those circumstances, like he acknowledged this painful process. That's why he told people, go in peace. He didn't say come to the synagogue. He said, go in peace. Go home. Go find yourself, is essentially what he was saying. Go process. This is going to be a heck of a lengthy process. Go in peace. Forget all these people and what they're telling you to do or not do. Go in peace. Those are some of the three most healing words that could ever be spoken to somebody. Not, you know, this is what you need to do. You need to pray more. You need to have more faith. You need to forgive. Jesus didn't tell people those things. He said, go in peace.
You know,
go in peace.
Well, and as a survivor sitting there watching this stuff being paraded, so to speak, across the stage in a religious institution, it does further damage because you're sitting there going, well, where was my miraculous transformation? Why didn't it happen for me?
Right.
And then you start down the whole path, and your identity in Christ has already been destroyed. So that just takes it a step further and just you're just sitting there going, okay, so go ahead.
I mean,
it brings up everything that everybody's always told you too. Like you don't have enough faith. You're full of bitterness. You know, on and on and on. Like all these cliches come to the surface and you begin to believe them. And you're like, maybe it is true. Maybe because I wasn't.
It just revalidates everything you already believed.
Yeah.
Everything bad that you already believed about yourself. Although you are not worthy. Next potential book title for me. That's it. You're not worthy.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I like that idea. But no, so we're going to have to wrap this up very shortly, folks. Do y'all have any parting words for people?
I know personally, like I don't want to leave people depressed and think that there are no good therapists, there are no good pastors, there are no good churches, like because that's just not true, right?
Right.
They're out there. Um, I think at this point it might be a little bit of a needle in a haystack, but I want to piggyback off of what Audrey said. Um, Learn to walk away. If there's a church that's not healing, walk away. If there's a therapist that's not healing, walk away. But don't just give up and don't say, well, there's none out there. I tried. You got to actively search and don't be afraid to do that, because they're out there. They really are. Like, and even if they're not professional therapists, they're school nurses. There are people out there who genuinely, legitimately care, who can help you heal. They're out there. They really are.
And when you walk away, don't blame yourself for being too
Yeah.
broken. You're not, it's not your responsibility that someone else doesn't understand and doesn't get it. Just keep trying, find another one. You will find your fit, you will find your niche, and it's different for all of us. One therapist does not fit all. And if you have a friend who's a survivor and they've found their fit and that doesn't fit for you, then there's no shame in finding your own fit. Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I just want to piggyback off of what Audrey said. I really think that it's very important to understand that there are good therapists out there, there are good medical doctors out there, there are good pastors out there, there are good churches out there. There's all kinds of wonderful people in the world, I promise you. It just can be a really difficult journey for a survivor to find those people that are theirs. But I would encourage you to continue looking. Don't accept unhealthy relationships with therapists and medical providers. Go find one that works for you. You deserve that. I promise you, you deserve that. And on that note, bye-bye. Until next time.